Emergency sheltering. I've been doing this off and on, I guess, since 2013 when I first became what we consider professional responders for the FIR team, and they're basically paid responders that we bring out and put into a lot of leadership positions. Between then and when I got hired on, I did take a break and went and worked at Larimer Humane Society as the director of operations for about 2 years before moving back to Kansas City and getting sucked back into this lifestyle of constantly traveling and setting up shelters and running around nonstop. Most of my focus is actually on cruelty case shelters or long-term temporary shelters. We've had a shelter open with the FIR team since March of 2013 in different places. Our long-term shelter right now is in Columbus, Ohio, and we've been there for just a little over 3 years and run, it's probably up to about 25 or 30 cruelty cases through that shelter in that time. So you need an emergency shelter. There are tons of considerations to keep in mind, and this probably doesn't even capture half of the things that you have to think about. Everything from how you're going to set it up, what it's going to look like, the different locations within the shelter, how it's broken up, the airflow, the big thing that we've been working on lately in Ohio with temperature control, how you keep the animals cool when it's really hot outside or how you keep them warm when it's really cold, the behavioral health, the medical health of the animals, how the handling of animals is going to work, if you're going to build them with exercise pens inside or if you're going to focus on taking dogs for walks, how you separate out the different species if possible, and how you're going to shut it down. That's one of the things that people don't think about from the very beginning, but that's something that you need to think about from day one. Is have an exit plan, have an idea of what it's going to look like to get out of there. Otherwise, you will be stuck with a bunch of animals that probably have owners for an extremely long time. And it's not what we sign up for when we help out with disasters. We want to help out as much as possible, but we also want to get those animals back into their homes or back with their owners as quickly as you can. So right location. There's a ton of different places that you can set up for an emergency shelter, and if you're looking at the idea of doing an emergency shelter where you live, say you're a part of a CART team or you're a humane society that has now been tapped to set up an emergency shelter, start thinking about it before you need it. Have a couple of ideas in mind and places that you can set up before the disaster strikes, because when you're scrambling at the last minute, you're going to end up in locations that aren't what you're wanting or don't offer the things that you need to actually care for the animals well. So a lot of the times you want something, you think you want something that looks like this, and this is what your idea is. You've got a big, beautiful warehouse with lots of overhead doors so you can get airflow. You have the space that you need. And this was actually one that we were looking at as a long-term emergency shelter for cruelty cases. A lot of the times this is what you end up with if you haven't planned ahead or if you're just jumping into a case quickly. This was actually another cruelty case that we did in Massachusetts. That was a farm animal case that I think we took in close to 2,000 animals on that one. Everything from pigs and cows to goats and any type of poultry or bird that you can think of. And then design and layout. You really need to spend time thinking about this before the animals come in, if at all possible, if you have any idea of what the numbers are going to look like. If it's your hometown that you're planning on setting up emergency shelters when you need it, you can have a pretty good gauge of the animal population in that area. And then you can base how you build it on what you think is going to come in. This design was an original cruelty case in Grandview, Missouri, I think it was set up. And you can see most of everything. This was a dog fighting case, but up at the top by the storage, there was a chicken area too, because there were a couple of roosters that they were branching off into cockfighting as well. This was the biggest case that I've ever worked on. This was in Waverly, New York, was this shelter, and it was a cockfighting case of 4,200 birds. Most of them from one farm. There was also a bust of a fight in progress. But it was 4,200 birds, a couple of cats, and then 2 goats that we housed in there as well for a while. And so the pod system we started really using in our cruelty cases and long-term housing. And it's not something that'll ever work perfectly in a disaster because you don't know what the space is going to look like. You don't know what the population of animals is going to look like. You don't know how it's going to flex from day to day. So it gets really difficult to build a pod system because it takes up a lot more space. But using them, it's almost like a shelter within a shelter. You have animals that stay in that pod, so you can build it to whatever size you think you need. Right now, in our long-term shelters, we have 12 dogs per pod, and that's how we built it out, and that's what we felt was a great number for your daily care workers to take care of on a daily basis. 1 person for 12 animals. You have dedicated equipment, you have dedicated personnel, you have dedicated PPE for those pods. So you're not spreading disease because you're moving your mop from one section to another or your broom from one section or another. You have a little bit better control over behavioral health because you can reorganize a smaller population of animals a whole lot easier than 150 dogs and trying to figure out where the one dog who isn't doing well will do well. Disease control is a little bit easier in a pod setup as well because if you have a disease outbreak, it's more contained than it would be in a very large shelter with hundreds of animals in it. It gives you a little bit additional security if you build perimeters around the pod. So if an animal escapes from their crate, they're kind of stuck in this smaller area, making them easier to catch. Really inefficient use of space, though, is the main problem with those. This was the layout design that we had done for a shelter that we didn't end up setting up. But the section that you see there is about 100,000 square feet, and we built it in a way that it was going to hold 240 dogs. So 100,000 square feet with crates, you can fit a whole lot more animals in there if it's needed. I wouldn't recommend packing it completely full unless you're in a disaster where you're just using every room that you can. And this is kind of what it looks like from the top down on a pod system. The way we set these up is with Magnum kenneling. I know a lot of you won't have the financial backing to buy this many Magnum kennels. They're not cheap. But for our long-term shelters and even some of our disaster shelters, we will set those up. Having some of these on hand for emergencies is really great for your aggressive dogs or dogs that are just really good at getting out of wire crates. It's amazing what dogs can do when you give them the chance to do it. This is another one that we had set up in Ohio. You'll see the bedding that we use in those is pine shavings. We found that it works really well for insulation in the winter. We've actually moved away from that in the kennels now to a recycled cardboard shaving that is a whole lot less dust producing, super easy to clean. It's a little bit more difficult to get a hold of and a little bit more expensive, but we found that it works a whole lot better than the pine shavings. Sometimes you do have to use rows, though. It just depends on how you have it set up. This picture was from a cockfighting shelter, I believe, in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And so rows of wire crates is definitely the way to go in a disaster if you're setting up super quickly. It just makes things a whole lot easier for the setup and the teardown. It makes the daily care fairly easy as well. It just means you're gonna have to use a whole lot more people in that area, and it's a lot more difficult to control disease issues or making sure that people are getting to all of the animals. We have little tricks that we do with that as well. This is an interesting shelter that we were working out of during Hurricane Florence in Robeson County, North Carolina. And At the back of the picture, you can see what appear to be built-ins, and those are built-in kennels. They had 100 built-in wire kennels, chain link fencing style kennels that ran the front half of the building, and then this back half of the building was just open. So we set up wire crates in there for all of the overflow that we needed after we filled up the built-ins. And we just continued on with the row set here because the space just wasn't good enough or wide enough for a pod system in there. And we had no idea what we were getting every day in that case. Animal control would go out or our boat teams would go out. The boat teams would usually give me a heads up when they were sending us animals and what animals they were sending us. Animal control, we had no idea. Like, we didn't even know animal control was out there doing that work until the first day at 4:30 they pulled in and they're like, hey, we've got 15 dogs for you. Where do you want them? It's like, oh, okay. Yeah, come on in. We'll figure it out. This was a really bad location for a shelter, but it was one of the few places that we could do in St. Croix when we spent 90 days down there. And we were able to set up a pod system within this open air, half the roof taken off, kind of lean-to on the Department of Ag grounds that we had. And so we set up pods for cats that were a little bit separated from the dogs. And then we had separate sections of dogs that were set up in a pod system as well. So it made it really easy for when we did have disease outbreaks, which we had a lot of them here, that we could control it a whole lot more and control the locations of areas that had the diseases. A couple more pictures of that one, or I guess one more picture of that one. You'll see on the side the tarps. That was needed because of the sun. Every afternoon, the sun was beating down that side directly into this space that we were at, to where without the tarps, half of the dogs would have been in direct sunlight in wire crates with black trays and would have just cooked in there. It wasn't a cool environment by any stretch. If you've ever been to the Virgin Islands, you know it's hot and humid all day long. And so we did everything that we could to kind of keep the sun off of the animals as much as possible. This one is a cockfighting case we did in Wisconsin last year, and it's kind of a mixture of group housing and individual housing. The cockfighting portion of this case was only about 75 of the 1,700 birds we pulled in. So we were really lucky that we could build giant coops for them that you can see them on the left-hand side. There's some that are built out of the magnums that we did for the dogs, and there's some that we built out of actual wood and chicken wire. You also need to be prepared for all sorts of different animals to come in. This cockfighting case brought in a ton of chicks. Out of those 1,700 birds, about 1,400 of them were chicks. A couple of them were moms with chicks, which were really easy. But you just need to be prepared. You never know what you're going to end up with, so having more supplies at the front end is usually a good idea, so you're not scrambling to figure out what's going on. Because of this case and the amount of supplies we didn't have because we weren't prepared for what we were getting, I now, anytime we do a cockfighting case, I ask our logistics folks to send me everything in the warehouse that has anything to do with chickens. Just send it. And it usually comes in really handy. But you just do what you can and make do with what you can. These tubs we had used before for deconning of large equipment, so we deconned them after they were used for decon to clean them out, had them shipped out, and the tops we found this, what was that place? It was a fairgrounds. They set up and would do showings. This was a poultry/rabbit showing area, and the tops were all parts of the rabbit hutches that they would set up that just happened to be there and worked perfectly for what we needed. And sometimes when you go out for disasters, you're a little bit surprised by what you get. This was January of 2018 in Montecito, California, after the mudslides, and the vast majority of the animals that we pulled in and sheltered for this were chickens, and it was almost entirely chickens. So we built what they started calling as the Chicken City on some property that was adjacent to them. And I think by the end, we had close to 270 birds from 35 different flocks that we all brought in and set them up in their own little flocks and kept them that way for the owners before they could come get them. Who would have thought that Montecito, everybody had chickens, along with all kinds of other crazy things. Yeah.
With the cockfighting chick birds, what the heck do you do with them?
At the end, a lot of our cockfighting cases end with mass depopulation of the birds, but if they are healthy, which isn't very common, we'll place as many of the hens as we can. So in the last couple of cases, we test for a bunch of different diseases within the chickens that I won't even try to act like I understand. But in most of our cases, 3 or 4 state reportable diseases pop up, and we get directed by the state vets that there's absolutely nothing that we can do with them. We did do a case in 2018 in Missouri where there wasn't really any major disease issues in there, and so we were able to place, I think it was about 300 hens with local partner agencies, and the cool thing with that was they were all adopted the day they arrived at their shelters. So they made it from our shelter to a partner and then into a home within about 24 hours. This one is Robeson County, or not Robeson County, this was Duncan, South Carolina. It was a mega shelter that we set up for evacuating animals from the coasts and from Florida, that all of the animals came up here, and then our amazing reload team got them out to everywhere else that they needed to go. This was another one that we had no idea what we were walking into or what we were going to get. This warehouse was found by a local cart team, perfect warehouse. It worked exactly as we needed it. But when I arrived the first day to build the shelter, or to start building the shelter, there were already 84 cats that had been dropped off that we needed to then build for really quickly. So I had the cart team, we built some crates, we got them set up. Unfortunately, when they built the crates and had them set up, this was a 30,000 square foot warehouse with 2 overhead doors that you could drive in. And that's where they set up all the crates, was right next to these overhead doors. So I thanked them. They went and did what the other things that they had to do, and I drove the minivan that I had in and slowly moved all the crates as far away from those overhead doors as I could get them. Got a call partway through that day saying, how many animals are in that shelter? And I said, well, I've got the 84 cats that I was told I was getting today. They're like, oh no, you should expect about another 200 coming in today. I was there by myself with a forklift waiting for the truck to arrive with all of our supplies. So I picked up the phone, I called the cart team lead and said, please send me anybody and everybody that you can right now. And he actually got about 30 people over, and we just started building crates and waited for animal control to show up with truckload after truckload after truckload of animals that they were evacuating from the coasts. This is another picture of that. You can see this front section with the clipboards turned up are all crates that are just waiting and ready to go for another group of animals to come in. All of them that are behind there with no clipboards turned up are already crates that we have filled with dogs. We ran about 850 animals through this shelter, and from the day I got there to set it up to the last day that we were there was 15 days. And we did all of that in that time period. It was pretty amazing. Another big thing that you have to think about when you're going to run an emergency shelter is personnel. How many do you need? What skill sets do you need? And you're going to need more than you probably think you do. Always err on the side of asking for more than you think you need, because you're probably not going to get as many people as you ask for. So always ask high. And then it might drop down a little bit and you'll make do with what you can. But you need to plan, and plan the team really considering what your ideal number is and what you need. And it's species dependent. You don't want a bunch of cat folks if it ends up being 150 dogs and they don't have a whole lot of experience handling dogs. You don't want just necessarily really good dog handlers if you end up with a bunch of farm animals or horses. So you really have to think about what species you're expecting to get in, and what kind of skills that you need. Fill your major functions first, your leads, the people that you need specific skill sets, your vets, your medical personnel, the leadership in the shelter, people who have either worked in emergency shelters before or have sheltering experience, and then you can fill underneath them with a lot of the hands-on daily work with volunteers, with local temps if you need to, with partner agencies. Just really focus on those leads first and then go down. And think about how long you're gonna be there. You don't wanna bring people in and then work them for 30 or 45 days straight. You're gonna need rotations. So get that first group in, think about how long you're gonna keep them. For us, we try to keep it at about 14 days at the max, and then make sure you have those people to rotate in after them that also have those skills. You don't wanna replace a really good shelter lead with somebody who's never done it before, because things are gonna start to drop off at that point. So these are just some of the roles that you will probably need to fill in any emergency shelter that you run. So your shelter manager is going to be the person that just kind of runs the show within the shelter, and you'll have that overarching person that everybody reports up to, all of the leads will report to. You need somebody who's in charge of the shelter. But you're going to need your leads, your handlers, your daily care folks, your medical lead, your technicians. You want to think about logistics and facilities people. You don't want to have to pull your daily care people to clean the bathrooms every day when there's 150 people using them. And you need people like logistics to get you the stuff that you need to do your job. As a daily care worker or a vet tech, you can't go run out to the store to buy brooms if you don't have any. You need to pay attention to that. I love having behavior on the ground for any of our disasters. I find them to be incredibly helpful, and they can focus on the behavioral health of the animals and allow daily care and the sheltering side of things to just focus on the cleaning, the walking, and that's part of it. Your resource unit is kind of like logs, but for people. They're the ones that are getting hotels, that are making sure that there's the food that needs to be eaten, that is helping you have all of the things you need to do your job. And then reunification and placement. It's another thing that you need to start thinking about from the very beginning. Where are these animals going to go? In a disaster, it would be lovely if all of the animals went back to their owners. It doesn't happen all the time. People lose their houses and they don't have any place to take an animal. There are animals that are just stray animals to begin with that had been stray before that have now come into the shelter that you can't track down owners. There's feral populations, especially of cats. Plan ahead on what you're going to do with those. Hopefully they don't make it into your shelter, but they're being taken care of in place. A lot of animals are going to do better being taken care of in place, as Dick talked about earlier. And that's in Montecito. That was the vast majority of what we did, was going and feeding animals in place, be it finches in people's kitchens to flamingos that they had in giant amazing pens in their backyards, to more tortoises than I've ever seen anywhere from different people. So try to keep them in place if you can. It's better to just take care of them there than it ever is to bring them into the shelter. So then you're gonna look at your command or your org chart. And this one is a little bit crazy, but this is something that you're gonna really have to think about when it comes to what it looks like on a daily basis in your shelter. You're going to need your daily care, you're going to need your medical, the behavior. If you're doing intake and removal, you're going to need those teams. But everybody should feed up to that one incident commander. In disasters, it's oftentimes Dick. For our cruelty cases, it's Tim Rickey, who's in charge of the fur team. Other times, once things calm down, maybe it's just one of your shelter manager is that head person if it's just focused on the sheltering. So really build out that org chart so people know who they report to. When Dick was talking about ICS earlier, that's really important for flow of information in a disaster setting. I can't go to Dr. G and say, hey, this is something that I need, and not loop in the people above us to make sure that it is something that we can get our hands on. So make sure that flow of communication is really well defined from the very beginning. And then for personnel, where to get them. You can use consultants. They're now called professional responders for us, but they're paid people who come out and help in these events. If it's a local event, you're probably not going to have a whole lot of paid consultants that you utilize. You're going to use volunteers, staff from partner agencies, and then temporary labor is something else you can think about. We use it a lot in our cruelty cases. Occasionally we'll use it in a disaster response as well, but local temp agencies are really good places to get just feet and people and somebody to be there to help out. You might not want to throw them into the middle of taking care of a pod right away, but they can do decon, they can do facilities, they can do a lot of the helping tasks that you need. And then volunteers. Lots of organizations, and I get a little bit scared as well, thinking about tons of volunteers in a disaster type setting, because they need training and they need to understand how you do what you're doing. But use them, utilize them as much as you can. So much talent is wasted through our fear of using people that we don't know. You just need to make sure that you have strong management in place and really good training, be it an orientation overview of what you're doing, but then just-in-time training where they're working side by side with somebody that you trust to train them to do the job. The temporary laborer is a thing that can be really helpful because they're local. They're fairly inexpensive in the grand scheme of things, and they're a blank slate. Most of them will come to you having no animal experience whatsoever, so you don't have to get them to do something differently than they're used to doing it. You train them to do things exactly like you want, and if all goes well, then they are doing things exactly like you want. And there's consistency there. These are folks that you can hire on to work a 5-day-a-week, 40-hour-a-week job. And this becomes their job, so they're definitely more likely to show up. And they're going to be there for much longer than your volunteers who are rotating in for a 7-day or a 14-day stint. These are folks that if you get them in early, get them in to help with the setup, can be there for the entire time that you have that shelter running. The big thing with them is just managing what's going on, but you also have a little bit of help from the temp agency as well, because since they are employed by the temp agency, if you have major issues, you can call them and they'll take care of those major issues for you. Otherwise, you just work with them on a daily basis to get them where you need. And then when you do have those rotations, have written transition documents. They are so helpful in any type of shelter that you're running, be it cruelty or disaster, that the person coming in knows what they're supposed to be doing and knows why they're supposed to be doing it. We use these in all of our shelters for all of our leadership positions. And it's a written document that not only goes to them, but goes to whoever their boss is and goes to our resources unit. So there's multiple people who know about what's going on and all of the moving parts within your division. And consistency is key. Always make sure that this is updated when people are rotating out and new people are rotating in. The things that you're going to include in these transitions are the responsibilities of not only the person who's coming in, but everybody that's working for them. And you could probably give a good overview of what the other divisions are doing as well, so that there's no overlap. What the daily schedule looks like. In our set long-term shelters, we work an 8 to 5 the vast majority of the time. In disasters, it's not going to be that nice. Campfire Dick tried to kill us. I think we were all working 16-hour days and living right there at the shelter. He is waving his finger at me, but it was true. Make sure your transitions either contain the protocols or show the person where the protocols are. You'll have protocols, hopefully, written up for everything that you do within the shelter, be it the medical side of things, the daily care side of things, the behavior side of things. There should be protocols for just about everything. And if you run into something as you're doing this that you don't have a protocol for, jot it down and write one when you can. You'll also list any ongoing projects, upcoming projects, or just anything they need to know. If there are volunteers who work really well with a certain type of animal, list that in there so they don't come in and then try to mix things up and put your cat volunteers with your dogs and your dog volunteers with your cats. And then your personnel training. There's two types of trainings that we really focus on between the orientation and the just-in-time. The orientation is more of that overview of the operation, the code of conduct, the ICS and what it looks like within that shelter, because it changes quite often from disaster to emergency shelters and even from disaster to disaster. Who's who? When I come into an emergency shelter or disaster, I want to know who's in charge of what. So if I need something from logistics, I know who to contact. Or it helps if I know who the medical lead is when I come in as shelter lead so that we can work together. And then give them a tour of the place. Show them where the restrooms are. Show them where the break area is. Show them where they can get food or coffee or water. These are all things that we don't think about a whole lot after we've been there for a while. But if you're brand new and you walk into this giant disaster shelter, you want to know where these things are that you're going to use really early on. The just-in-time training is going to be a more in-depth look at the role that person is playing. And you're hopefully going to get them in with somebody, either the shelter lead or somebody who's already doing that work. Have them shadow for a day before you set them loose, and then go over safety with them. There's always things that pop up in disaster shelters, and the way things are labeled or documented safety-wise changes based on what you have available for you. In our long-term emergency shelters, all of our animals are color-coded with green, yellow, red, and black. Greens are animals that basically anybody can handle and should be comfortable handling. They're your really easy dogs and cats. Yellows are ones that are a little bit more tricky. They're not necessarily dangerous, but they could have other animal issues. They could be mouthy, jumpy. They could be door dashers, things that you need to know that you don't want to just throw a temporary worker who's never handled animals before in to work with the yellow labeled ones. And once you get up to yellow, red, and black, put instructions or reasons on there as well. The red for us are what are considered designated handler animals, and we have people specifically in the shelter who are considered designated handlers. These are your highly skilled individuals who have a lot of experience handling difficult and aggressive animals, and they're the only ones you ever want handling any of them that you label as a designated handler. And for us, our black category are animals that are hands-off. Nobody touches them. You build them in ways that they can be shifted from where they live into an exercise pen and back in there, so nobody has to handle them at all. So protocols and job descriptions. You need protocols for everything. Anything that you're going to ask somebody to do, you need to have instructions on how to do it. Be it the intake process, how to clean a cage in isolation compared to general population, how you're going to feed the animals, how you're going to clean dishes, how you're going to decon other stuff, how you mix whatever you're using for decon, and what level it's mixed at. If you're using Excel, are you mixing it at a 1/16 or a 1/32, and the reasons why you're doing that. What kind of handling you're trying to do. We have manners and training interactions and wait at the gate and 4 on the floor and all kinds of things that we do in our long-term shelters that we're not necessarily doing in our emergency shelters, but you want to train people on how to get a dog out of a crate easily, or show them tips and tricks that you've learned on the animals that you're working with. On here's a feral cat in a crate, this is how we've been cleaning them. What to do if you have a loose dog or a loose cat. If you're moving lots of animals at a time and you have walkie-talkies, how you communicate that over the radio so people know you don't end up running 2 aggressive dogs into each other. And then have job descriptions for all of the positions that you're putting people in that you can give to people and say, you have been brought in to do daily care. Here's your job description. I mean, it would be horrible for all of us if we were working jobs without job descriptions and we had no idea what was expected of us or why. Have those for them. Have all of your protocols look the same. So that way people, when they're flipping through them, they know exactly how to look at them and where to find the information that they're looking for. And make flowcharts for people. These are the easiest way to show people the work that needs to be done and how to do it. We have these hanging up in all of our shelters wherever they're needed. So for how to spot clean a kennel, we'll have that in the kennels, and they'll be hanging up in the pods or hanging up at the end of a row. And have all of your protocols, all of your flow charts, all of your job descriptions in a binder for people that you keep in the break area. So that way when they have downtime, if they're eating lunch and they're like, you know, how do I do this? They can open up this binder and flip through and find out really easily. So daily operations, you're gonna have a ton of people if it's a fairly large disaster. You're gonna wanna start out every morning with a morning briefing, just to give people an update, a large overview of what's going on, both with the disaster and within the shelter itself. After that daily briefing, it's really good to have breakouts for each of the different divisions. And we still do this in our long-term shelters after we've been there for 3 years, and we're doing the same things all the time. We still have daily briefings. We then break out to the daily care folks. We'll talk about what they're doing. Medical will go talk about what they're doing. Behavior will do that as well. And that way they get the large group briefing, that's the huge overview of everything. And then it makes it down to the different groups. They get a little bit more in-depth briefings on what they're expected for that day. And have your command structure broken out, and let people know who they need to talk to for different things. A lot of times in a disaster, you want your daily care workers to move up the chain of command to either their floor lead or the shelter lead, instead of going directly to medical to ask for something or directly to logistics to ask for something, because they might not know what else is going on. If I have people come to me saying, hey, we need brooms, can you ask logistics to do this? And I'm like, they just picked up brooms. I know exactly where they are. We're not wasting time and spinning wheels doing things that don't need to be done. And then the big one that we continue to work on, but it's super important, is any sheltering decisions needs to be an overarching discussion with medical, behavior, and sheltering. I'm not going to start moving animals around or changing the layout of the shelter without talking to the medical lead and the behavior lead. Hopefully you're having these meetings on a daily basis so you can be in constant communication. My idea for a new layout in a shelter might be completely thrown out the window if medical says, here's why these animals need to stay over here and these animals need to stay over here. And the same thing with behavior. A lot of times when we focus on sheltering, we just focus on the medical health, but the behavioral health, especially in disasters, is also incredibly important. You don't want to put your really fearful dogs right next door to the really loud, I'm gonna bounce off the kennels and spin around and bark nonstop dogs. You want to keep your species as separated as possible. Housing dogs and cats right there together, probably not a good idea, and it's a good way to get bit by a really fractious or fearful animal. It's the same way with places where don't put your cats and your rabbits together, because rabbits don't really like to be around cats. And if you've ever tried to handle a rabbit after they've hung out with cats for a while, it can be really, really difficult. And just having the people, like if you're working with cats, wash your hands before you go work with the rabbits. Just get that smell off of you as much as possible. But these are all things that'll pop up during those MBS meetings. And they can be quick, just little powwows for 15 minutes once a day to say, hey, do you guys have anything that I need to know about? Here are the things that you need to know about. And just keep that communication chain going, because the worst thing that can happen is sheltering's off doing their thing and medical's off doing their thing, and we're doing things that are competing against each other. It never works out well. So have these meetings as much as possible. Yes?
I understand how you're saying separate species, obviously, that's obvious. But in cases where you're having like disasters and animals come from the same family and they're swimming together, do you try to keep them together when you have to do that?
If we can, usually in the emergency shelters that we set up, no. It becomes really difficult to have as much segmented little sections like that. Like if a family has 3 dogs and 2 cats, usually those will be separated by species in the shelter, but we'll try to keep those 3 dogs together and we'll try to keep those 2 cats together. If we had like a huge, amazing place where we could do that, then we would try to do it. But most of the time we're running around just putting out fires that it's really hard to keep all of those things coordinated. That's why the cohabitated shelters work perfectly, because all of those could go and stay in their little family unit. The admissions process is the very first thing that the animals are going to see when they come in. You're going to have people who are doing the data entry and working with the clients if they're bringing their own animals in, or working with whatever agency is bringing them in, be it animal control or your field teams or however it's working. You want to staff that with medical personnel. You're going to staff it with good handlers. So when you're vaccinating and deworming, you have somebody that's helping the medical personnel do all of that. If you have the ability to staff a behavior person up there, I would do that as well. Just their knowledge is going to help out all kinds of different things. But this team is going to identify the animals and figure out a way to make sure that that identification stays on the animal, be it a collar that has an ID number written on it, a tag that has the animal's name on it already, anything like that that you can continue to have identification, because the last thing you want to happen is when to blow all of the paperwork off the kennels and then you're going, oh crap, who is who? Or somebody coming in and like moving things around without thinking about it, or going, I think these 2 dogs have switched, so let's switch these paperwork, which all those things happen. Or really angry people who are no longer there taking all of the paperwork with them when they leave, which may or may not happen as well. But this will also, they'll be the ones that are going to assign the location of where the animals are going. Hopefully they'll have a map in front of them that comes up on a daily basis that shows these are the available kennels. They're going to really be the first line for that inventory control that you're going to want to keep. And it's going to change, be disaster versus cruelty. Your disaster, your intake and admissions people are super important and very public facing. And they've got the most difficult job of anybody in that shelter. Thinking about the campfire when we were up there in California, the folks that I had working in that tent had the most emotionally draining job I have ever seen. And it was people coming in looking for their animals, animals coming in, people finding their animals, and it's highs and lows. I worked intake in Joplin after the tornado, and it was, I would be working with this person who was bringing me their animal because they had just lost everything and they had nowhere for them to go, and talking to them and finding out their history and what was going on and watching them super upset because they're giving up their animal for the time being. And then turning immediately to help somebody who had just found their animal, was super happy and crying tears of joy, and it wears on you. So keep an eye on those folks and take care of them. It's really, really important, and you have to have the right people in there. If you put people in there who don't want to work with people, it's just going to go downhill really, really quickly. You have to have really good customer service to work in that location. Medical, I won't talk as much about them since Dr. G did already, but you're going to have your basic 2 teams in the shelter, your intake teams who are doing the routine intake exams, the vaccinating, the deworming, flea and tick if it's needed, and everything else that they decide medically needs to be done as the animals are coming in. And then your ongoing care. A daily vet is super important, especially at the beginning of a disaster. Once things calm down, you don't have the population of animals changing with more coming in on a daily basis, you can drop down if need be. I would prefer to have a vet in any shelter that I work every day. It just makes things that much easier. Your daily care folks are going to be your eyes and ears when it comes to medical and behavioral concerns. They're the ones that have the hands-on interaction with the animals on a daily basis. So make sure that they have ways to communicate that with medical. And the medical concern boards, Doc had one in hers, and I think I have a slide a little bit closer, or in a couple as well. Your daily care flow, another flow chart that we have hanging up. It just makes it easy for people to understand what they're supposed to be doing. We also have a daily care flow that I don't have in here that's broken out by the time period. So those are hanging up in all of the animal pods in all of our shelters, and you walk in, you can look at it. Oh, it's 10:15. What am I supposed to be doing? Oh, it's break time now, so I'm going to go do that. And that type of thing. If you have all of the information right there where they can easily access it, then you don't have to constantly run around reminding people what time it is to do. Break down your daily care to where you don't want your shelter lead running all of your daily care workers unless it's a fairly small shelter, because they're going to be doing tons of other things and probably pulled into meetings quite often. So you're going to have your floor leads who are the true just managers of folks doing daily care. And then you're going to have, if you can, an enrichment coordinator who their whole job is to make sure that animals are getting what they need to stay sane while they're in your shelter environment, be it different types of enrichment, be it daily walks, be it multiple walks. Just if you can have somebody that goes around working in tandem with behavior, focusing on the enrichment needs of the animals, you're going to be better off in the long run. Have cage cards if you can, any type of cage card, even if it's handwritten, so you know what animal is in there. If you can, put how much they're being fed, some basic description of them, any information that people who are going to that kennel are going to need to know. You can have behavior cards as well that we use, business card holders with business cards that have all kinds of different information that you can slide in and hang up on a kennel and then move and mix and match as needed. Daily observation sheets. The next slide, you'll see what that looks like, where you're monitoring how they're eating, how they're going to the bathroom, if they've got any URI signs, if they've been vomiting or anything like that, and then your medical and behavior concern boards. So this daily observation sheet, I think, was originally done by UC Davis, and we kind of changed it a little bit. But we monitor all of our animals twice a day. So we're doing this after the first feeding, giving them a chance to eat, and then going through and seeing if they're eating, if they've gone to the bathroom, if it looks normal, or if it's something that we should probably let medical know about. And then any of the other symptoms that they might be coming down with some sort of illness, you can document on there and let medical know about as well. So Doc's picture was better than mine for a medical concern board. We've actually changed these into just concern boards in our shelters. So medical information goes down in one color, sheltering goes down in a different color, and behavior goes down in a different color. And our on-the-ground rounds team of medical behavior and sheltering go through when they do rounds every other day, look at these, see what needs to be addressed, and then also lay their eyes on all of the animals. Feeding can be overwhelming in an emergency shelter, so make it easy. We've tried multiple different things. This was at the time when we had a feeding chart of what everybody got in every pod. Each pod had its own black bin, and then in the afternoons, people were responsible for making 2 sets of feeding for every dog in that pod, and then it would go. You might find it easier to just have the black bins filled with food and food trays there so that they can go, see what amount of food they get, scoop it out, and just give it to them right then. Really identify special diets if they're needed for any reason. You're going to want to monitor weight as much as possible, not as necessary in an emergency shelter that's only going to be there for 30 days, but for long-term housing, you want to make sure that your dogs and cats are getting enough to keep the weight on and not getting more than they need, so you don't end up with a bunch of super fat animals. The last thing you want to do is return somebody's dog 45 days later who has now gained 25 pounds, unless they needed to. And then maternity and nursing, you're going to have different protocols for dogs that are pregnant, and cats. I always say dogs, but any animal who is pregnant who's nursing young. You're going to feed them more than you would if they were just neither of those. So you're cleaning and disinfecting. If you can, keep it fairly simple and the same across the board as much as possible. Going into a disaster type setting, I like to use a 116 mixture of Excel because I know that that's just going to get rid of everything and you never know what you're going to have. You can drop that down a little bit to maybe a 1 to 32 in a long-term housing situation where everybody's medical conditions are kind of under control and you're not concerned about things changing. And tell the people the why behind the how. You're going to make it much easier for them, and they're going to be much more likely to follow protocols if they know there's a reason for that protocol to be in place. So explain to them what the difference between cleaning and disinfecting is. Tell them what disinfectant you're using. If they're working in an isolation area, let them know what diseases that you've seen and why it's an isolation area and why we're not trying to spread things. And try to make it as efficient as possible. In our shelters, we have big Gatorade 5-gallon cooler things with the spout at the bottom, and we fill that with pre-mixed Excel solution so they can just come, fill up their squirt bottle, and they don't even have to think about the mixing side of things. And then enrichment. You're going to want to figure out ways to keep these animals active. So it can be exercise. You can have walking pens or walking yards, exercise pens. Give them toys. Engage the animals in play safely, but engage them in play. Some of the things that you're going to have to consider are your species of animals. You're going to do things with dogs that you're not going to do with horses and vice versa. If you can set up outdoor exercise areas, I would highly recommend it. Getting the animals fresh air and sunshine and just being out of a shelter environment is always a good thing. You can also set up indoor exercise areas. Change the environment in those exercise areas. If you have the ability to put in like pause tables or even just running broomsticks through a couple of milk crates so it gives the dog something to jump over. Just anything that you can do to keep their minds active. The more physically and mentally active they stay, the better they're going to do in your shelter. Use puzzle feeders and puzzle toys to give out enrichment to the animals. If you have them for long periods of time, work on training manners. Teach them to sit, lay down. Or if they already know it, get them to go through their routine. Any type of routine like that's going to benefit them. And then play groups are something that we have done. I would let your behavior folks focus on that. Let them do it. Exercise pens can be built in all kinds of different ways and varieties, and you can use Magnum panels, you can use the 10-foot chain link panels that you can get at like Tractor Supply. You can build them in rectangles or you can build them in octagons, so it's a racetrack. Those are great for dog fighting dogs. Put them in there, throw in a jolly ball, and let them run around chasing it for a while. It'll wear them out better than anything else that you're going to be able to do with them. If you're there for a while, put together an enrichment schedule. So you're not giving them the same things each day. It changes. And you can do this with really cheap things, like keep your paper towel rolls and shove a couple of pieces of paper in the end with some treats in the center, maybe some peanut butter or some wet food. If you can get access to Kongs, you use them. We found that egg cartons with a little bit of peanut butter and some treats in it give them something to do, and it's almost like a little puzzle toy. If it's a really hot environment and you have access to deep freezes, freeze things. Popsicles for us are just little Dixie cups filled with a broth and some kibble and frozen. Pop those out and give them to them, and it gives them something to chew on for a little while. If you have really crazy over-the-top dogs, you can take buckets and fill it up the same way, put a chain in it, drop it down in there, and then you can hang those and let them just chew on them for a while. Scents are also something that people don't think about a lot, but scents, dogs and cats smell way better than we do. So use scent enrichment, but make sure you're using scents that they actually like and aren't going to be aversive to them, and know the difference in what your scents are going to do. Like, we use way more scents than I can even name off right now in our shelters, but we have some that are more calming that we use in kennel, and then we have things like sow in heat and coyote urine and all of the really gamey ones that we use in their play areas because it gets them amped up and helps them play.
What's the potluck?
Potluck is whatever is available. It's kind of our way of using stuff before it gets old. Yeah, so you just go, and you could grab a couple of Kongs, a bully stick or two, and then a popsicle and hand those out, type of thing. Kongs are your greatest friend, and Kong has a second that you can ask them to donate, or you can buy cheaply and you can get tons of Kongs for a very inexpensive amount of money. But make sure you're giving things to the animals based on what they need. Cats, give them scratching posts, please. Give them toys to play with. Cats are really easy when it comes to toys. You can do a lot with pipe cleaners and with ping pong balls and things that are really super cheap. And then also think about some of the other animals you're gonna have. If you're gonna get chickens, what do you need? Nesting boxes for hens are gonna help them remain a whole lot more calm. What are you gonna need if you end up with pigs? Which you might. In Arkansas, where they recently were, they had a pig. You never know when those are gonna pop in. And then when closing the shelter, have a plan. Know what you're gonna do as you go into the shelter, how you're gonna close it down. Have a timeline in place. Know what your placement options are if you're doing reunifications. What you're gonna do with the animals who don't get reunified or you can't find their owners. If you're gonna adopt them out there and have an adoption event. If you're gonna transfer them to partner agencies. Or for the animals that are owned that you can't keep in the shelter for that long, are you gonna have foster homes available for them? Can you help facilitate that for the owners so that they can get their animals back in the future? And then your demobilization, decon, storage, how you're gonna do all of that. We just kind of talked about the placement side of things. If you do an adoption event, go big. And then demob. This is the part that nobody thinks about. It's like you've set up this shelter, you've done a great job, you've gotten all the animals out of there. You can't just walk out. You have everything that you've used that you now need to tear down, you need to clean up, you need to pack it up, you need to ship it out. And most importantly, you need to leave whatever you've used as your shelter in a better state than you took it. So it might involve getting floor machines to clean the floors of a warehouse. You've probably done some upgrades if you're in a fairgrounds or a lean-to that's just covering, or tents. Try to make things look as good as possible when you leave, because the last thing you want is to use something great as a disaster shelter and then you need to use it again and the people are like, no, you left that place a mess. We're never gonna let you come back in here. So just be good stewards. Cool, thank you.